1,000 years ago, something impossible happened in the New Mexico desert. A civilization rose so dramatically that archaeologists still can't explain it, then vanished without a trace, or so we thought. For centuries, scholars told one story. The people of Chaco Canyon simply disappeared, scattered to the winds, lost to history. But in April 2025, DNA revealed the truth. They didn't disappear, they survived. They continued. And a federally recognized tribe just became the first in U.S. history to prove through science what their ancestors had been saying for millennia. We never left, we were always here. What DNA is now revealing about this hidden continuity rewrites everything we thought we knew about ancient America. Imagine standing in the desert of northwestern New Mexico, surrounded by the weathered remnants of a civilization that bewilders every academic institution in America. Pueblo Bonito towers before you, not as a museum piece, not as an artifact from a textbook, but as evidence of something that shouldn't exist. A massive great house constructed with mathematical precision, built roughly 900 years ago, during a period when Europe was still in the early medieval period, when most of North America had barely begun organizing beyond scattered settlements. This structure and dozens like it spread across the canyon, in a pattern so deliberate, so architecturally sophisticated, that when archaeologists first documented Chaco Canyon in the late 1800s, they couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed about prehistoric America. For more than a century, this site has presented a problem that no amount of conventional thinking could solve. The traditional narrative that emerged from academic institutions was both elegant and reassuring. There had been a civilization here, yes, but it was temporary, chaotic perhaps, unsustainable, a cultural experiment that ultimately failed. The people who built Pueblo Bonito and constructed the intricate road network spreading hundreds of miles across the Southwest must have simply moved elsewhere when conditions deteriorated. They scattered. They vanished. Some went north, some went south, some disappeared entirely into the archaeological record. This wasn't presented as speculation or incomplete knowledge. It was presented as established fact. Thousands of textbooks reinforced this narrative. Museums displayed artifacts with this interpretation as context. University departments built entire research programs on the assumption that Chaco Canyon was a chapter that had closed definitively, a civilization without descendants, a society that left behind only ruins and questions. But here's what most people are not seeing. This narrative was constructed almost entirely without input from the people who actually lived there. The Pueblo tribes of New Mexico, 19 sovereign nations operating in the region today, had been telling a completely different story. Their oral traditions, preserved through centuries of colonization, violence, forced relocations, and attempts at cultural erasure, consistently stated that their ancestors came from Chaco Canyon, and that the people of Chaco didn't abandon the region. They migrated gradually, maintained connections, and continued their lineage in the pueblos that exist today. These accounts weren't treated as history by mainstream academia. They were treated as folklore, as mythology, as cultural memory corrupted by time. When indigenous leaders brought their oral histories to archaeologists, they were politely listened to and then set aside. The scientific establishment had its narrative, and it didn't require amendment from oral tradition. What happened in April 2025 fundamentally altered this dynamic in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Researchers at the University of Copenhagen, working in partnership with the Picuris Pueblo, a federally recognized tribe of now only 306 people, published findings in the journal Nature that did something unprecedented in American science. They proved the oral histories correct, but more importantly, they allowed the Picuris people themselves to lead the research that established this proof. This wasn't archaeologists extracting knowledge from indigenous burial sites without permission. This wasn't outside institutions interpreting ancient remains through the lens of Western academic assumptions. This was the first time in the history of the United States that a federally recognized indigenous tribe led and co-authored a genomic study of its own ancestry. The methodology was meticulous and deliberate. Researchers extracted DNA from tiny samples of bones and teeth, each sample less than 1/20th of a teaspoon in size, from 16 ancient individuals buried at Picuris Pueblo. These remains dated to between 1300 and 1500 CE, placing them squarely in the period when Chaco Canyon had supposedly been abandoned and its people dispersed. The team then collected saliva samples from 13 currently enrolled members of the Picuris Pueblo. But here's where the analysis expanded beyond what most archaeological studies attempt. They compared these genomes not just against each other, but against 300 populations from the Americas and more than 5,500 individuals from around the world. They weren't just checking to see if the Picuris connected to Chaco. They were checking what populations ancient and modern Picuris were most closely related to, what genetic signature defined their ancestry, and whether that signature appeared anywhere else. The results created a genetic signal so clear that it demolished the prevailing academic narrative in a single moment. Ancient Picurus individuals and modern Picures people formed a distinct genetic cluster, more closely connected to each other across 7 centuries than to any other population measured. This demonstrated continuity, not migration, not replacement, not population collapse and distant relocation, but continuous inhabitation and lineal descent. The DNA didn't just confirm that Picures Pueblo people were related to individuals buried in their pueblo 7 centuries ago. It proved that this relationship extended back further, to Chaco Canyon itself. The same genetic markers that appeared in modern Picures people were present in ancient remains recovered from Pueblo Bonito, the largest structure in Chaco Canyon and the ceremonial center of the civilization. Think about what this means. While academic institutions were publishing theories about population dispersal and cultural collapse, while archaeologists were constructing narratives about a civilization that vanished, the people of Picures Pueblo were living out the genetic reality of unbroken descent. They were the descendants of Chaco Canyon, not through absorption into other populations, not through recolonization of an abandoned site, but through direct lineal descent preserved across 1,300 years. When they told their oral histories, they were recounting the actual movements of their ancestors. When they spoke about connections to Chaco Canyon, they were describing genetic relationships that would later be confirmed by the most advanced tools modern science possesses. But the DNA revealed something even more extraordinary about Chaco Canyon's internal structure that transforms how we understand the civilization itself. Earlier research, published in Nature Communications, had identified something extraordinary within Pueblo Bonito, an elite matrilineal that persisted for approximately 330 years, from about 800 to 1130 CE. 9 individuals buried in an elite crypt within Pueblo Bonito possessed identical mitochondrial genomes. Analysis of nuclear DNA from the most well-preserved samples demonstrated mother-daughter and grandmother-grandson relationships, showing a multi-generational female lineage that maintained its genetic identity across centuries. This wasn't just kinship, this was an established system of inheritance through the female line, a persistent matriarchal dynasty embedded in the very architecture of Chaco's greatest structure. What this reveals about Chaco's social organization contradicts years of speculation from scholars who had suggested the civilization operated without hierarchical structure, or that power shifted constantly between competing groups. This elite matrilineal suggests something far more sophisticated: an organized system of power transmission, a female-centered inheritance system, and a clear understanding of genetic descent that motivated the careful placement of burials in a designated elite crypt. The women of this lineage didn't simply bear children, they bore authority. They maintained privilege, they transmitted power across generations, and they left a genetic signature so distinctive that it survives in the DNA of Picures Pueblo women living nearly 1,000 years later. Now, consider the population dynamics revealed through demographic analysis of the genetic data. After Picures people left Chaco Canyon around 1200 CE, the population stabilized at roughly 3,000 individuals. This number is critical because it represents a population large enough to maintain genetic continuity across centuries. It's not a small remnant group that might disappear through intermarriage or assimilation. It's a viable, reproductive population capable of sustaining itself across generations. But then, something catastrophic happened. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Southwest in the 1500s, the Picures population experienced a collapse so severe that contemporary anthropological documentation has often underestimated its magnitude. The DNA data shows what historical records only partially capture: a 95% reduction in population numbers. Let that number settle. 95%, nearly complete annihilation. This wasn't recorded in most historical texts as genocide, but the genetic data identifies it as exactly that. Disease introduced from European contact, violence perpetrated by colonial forces, forced relocations, cultural suppression, and the deliberate destruction of traditional practices. All of this combined to reduce the Picures from a sustainable population of thousands to scattered survivors. The fact that 306 people remain today isn't a triumph of population recovery. It's the remnant of a catastrophe. It's a population that came within inches of extinction. The fact that any genetic continuity persists across this bottleneck is itself remarkable. Understanding why the Picures initiated this research in the first place adds another layer to the significance of these findings. The trigger wasn't academic curiosity or cultural nostalgia, it was threat. In recent years, proposals for oil and gas development adjacent to Chaco Canyon have accelerated. Extraction industries have begun acquiring permits and planning operations in the immediate vicinity of one of North America's most significant archaeological sites. For tribal leadership, particularly individuals like former Governor Richard Bermejo, who played a critical role in initiating the research before his death in 2024, the situation presented an urgent imperative They needed scientific evidence of their ancestral claim to Chaco Canyon, evidence that would carry weight in policy discussions and environmental impact assessments. Oral history alone wouldn't be sufficient. They needed a language that Western institutions understood, genetic proof. In 2020, Picouris Pueblo leadership contacted evolutionary geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen. They proposed a partnership unlike anything that had been attempted in the history of American genomic research. The tribe would maintain control. Tribal members would co-author the research. Consent would be non-negotiable. The remains of their ancestors would not be extracted and analyzed without explicit permission, without clear understanding of how the results would be used, and without tribal leadership maintaining authority over the research direction. This represented a fundamental reversal of the colonial model that has dominated archaeological and anthropological research in North America for centuries. Indigenous peoples were not subjects to be studied. They were researchers conducting their own investigation into their own history. The results, when they arrived, provided exactly what the tribe needed: incontrovertible scientific evidence of their ancestral connection to Chaco Canyon. But in proving this, the study also demonstrated something about the nature of historical knowledge that has broader implications beyond this single case. For hundreds of years, Western academic institutions assumed that written documentation and archaeological evidence constituted the only legitimate forms of historical knowledge. Oral traditions were treated as preliminary, incomplete, prone to corruption over time. Yet here, a body of oral history that had been dismissed repeatedly, and dismissed again by professional historians and archaeologists, turned out to be more accurate than the theories constructed by academic experts working with fragmentary physical evidence. The Picouris people had correctly remembered their ancestral connection to Chaco Canyon, despite centuries of colonization. They had preserved this memory through violence, relocation, suppression, and cultural pressure that attempted to erase their connection to pre-Columbian civilization. When genetic analysis became sophisticated enough to test these memories against biological evidence, the oral histories proved accurate. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally and scientifically accurate. This raises fundamental questions about how Western institutions have treated indigenous knowledge, about what we've dismissed as myth or legend, and about how many other oral histories from indigenous peoples might contain historical truth that our current academic frameworks simply lack the tools to recognize. But the broader implication extends even further. If Picouris Pueblo oral histories were correct about their ancestral connection to Chaco Canyon, then we must reconsider what else they might be correct about. The Picouris are one tribe among 19 in the region that maintain historical claims to various aspects of Chaco Canyon and its influence sphere. The study explicitly states that findings do not refute the historical connections of other tribes to Chaco Canyon. Every other Pueblo nation in New Mexico likely has equally valid oral histories connecting them to different aspects of ancestral Pueblo civilization. This single DNA study opens a door to rewriting the entire narrative of southwestern prehistory, but only if institutions are willing to move beyond the assumption that academic documentation supersedes indigenous memory. What this research also changes is our understanding of civilization stability and cultural continuity. For decades, the predominant model of Chaco Canyon emphasized collapse, failure, and dispersal. This narrative reflected academic assumptions about civilizations and how they function. We assumed that when environmental conditions deteriorated, whether through drought, resource depletion, or social conflict, civilizations either adapted in place or dispersed completely. We believed in either-or scenarios. People either remained and transformed, or they left and scattered. The Chaco narrative suggested neither scenario applied. Instead, the civilization had failed and its people had vanished into history. But the genetic evidence suggests a third model entirely: graduated migration with maintained connection. The Picouris and related Pueblo peoples didn't abandon Chaco Canyon in a single catastrophic event. Instead, over the course of a century or so, different groups relocated to surrounding regions, established themselves in new territories, but maintained cultural and genetic ties to their original homeland. They didn't sever their relationship with Chaco. They transformed it. They created what might be described as a distributed cultural network with different pueblos in different locations, but all sharing ancestry and maintaining connection to the center. This pattern of gradual relocation and maintained identity is far more sophisticated than a simple collapse narrative, and it suggests that ancestral Pueblo civilization was more resilient and adaptive than scholars had previously appreciated. The timing of these migrations also carries significance. DNA evidence suggests Picouris people left Chaco Canyon around 1200 CE, during the period when Chaco Canyon's role as a central ceremonial and administrative site was already diminishing. This wasn't necessarily a panicked flight from a collapsing center. It might have been a deliberate, planned migration occurring in response to environmental changes or social evolution. The population maintained itself in the northern Rio Grande Valley, where conditions may have been more sustainable given prevailing climate patterns. The fact that Picures Pueblo has continuously occupied the same general region for nearly 900 years suggests that this migration was exceptionally well planned, successful from a demographic perspective, and sustainable across centuries. What becomes clear when you examine this research in the context of broader patterns of colonization in North America is that the dismissal of oral history wasn't simply an oversight or a limitation of 19th century anthropology. It was ideological. The establishment of American academic institutions required a narrative that positioned indigenous peoples as historically disconnected from their lands, as inhabitants rather than ancestral occupants, as populations whose presence in North America was recent rather than deep and continuous. If Native American peoples could demonstrate unbroken lineage to specific territories extending back 1,000 years, then claims to sovereignty, land rights, and cultural authority became far more difficult to challenge. The narrative of dispersal, collapse, and disconnection served colonial interests precisely because it weakened historical claims that indigenous nations might assert based on ancestral occupation. This is why the Picures Pueblo's assertion of authority over this research process matters so much. By controlling the methodology, by ensuring tribal co-authorship, by maintaining the right to determine how results would be used and interpreted, the Picures established a model for research that recognizes indigenous peoples as authorities over their own history. This challenges the fundamental structure of how academic research has historically treated indigenous peoples and their lands. It suggests that future research partnerships should operate on the assumption of tribal authority and consent, not as favors granted by academics to indigenous communities. Looking at the geopolitical context reveals why this timing proves significant. The research was published in April 2025, precisely during a moment when debates over energy development adjacent to Chaco Canyon are escalating. The presence of oil and gas resources near the canyon has attracted industry interest, and permits for extraction have been pursued by energy companies. The Picures Pueblo, possessing now irrefutable genetic evidence of their ancestral connection to the site, stands in a far stronger position to assert interests in how the surrounding region develops. They're not simply cultural descendants, they're proven genetic descendants. They're not appealing to oral tradition, they're backed by peer-reviewed research published in the world's most prestigious scientific journal. The implications for indigenous sovereignty and land rights extend far beyond this single canyon. The study also begins to address one of archaeology's most persistent mysteries. What happened to the great roads of Chaco Canyon? Archaeologists have documented an extensive system of roads radiating outward from Chaco Canyon, connecting it to satellite settlements across hundreds of miles. These roads weren't simply trade routes. They appear to have served ceremonial functions and administrative purposes. For centuries, scholars speculated about who maintained these roads, how long they remained functional, and whether the network persisted after Chaco Canyon's decline. The genetic data suggesting that Picures people maintained connection with the broader Chaco regional system implies that these roads, or the social networks they represented, continued functioning longer than previously assumed. Picures Pueblo maintains oral histories of pilgrimages to Chaco Canyon. These oral traditions might describe the operation of these networks across generations. The demographic collapse following Spanish contact represents another tragedy that DNA analysis illuminates with precision that historical documents cannot provide. While historians have documented the brutal realities of colonization, the genetic bottleneck quantifies the human cost in terms that make the scale of loss undeniable. 95% population decline means that for nearly every person who survived to reproduce and pass on their genetic lineage, 19 others died without having children. It means that most lineages were completely extinguished. It means that cultural knowledge, accumulated across generations, was lost irretrievably. It means that languages, traditions, ceremonial practices, and intellectual systems were erased. The fact that Picures Pueblo persists at all, that they maintain any continuity with their ancestral civilization, is remarkable, given the magnitude of this catastrophe. Yet catastrophe alone doesn't explain their continuity. Survival required active preservation. It required individuals who maintained cultural knowledge during centuries when that knowledge was suppressed or dangerous to practice openly. It required a commitment to preserving connection to Chaco Canyon despite generations of pressure to assimilate into dominant American culture. It required leadership, exactly the kind of leadership demonstrated by individuals like Richard Mermello, who recognized that genetic evidence might provide tools for asserting tribal authority and land rights. These human decisions, these choices to maintain cultural connection despite enormous pressure not to, are what transform biological survival into cultural continuity. The implications of this research extend beyond Chaco Canyon to how entire continents might need to be remapped in terms of indigenous continuity. If Picurius Pueblo can demonstrate genetic connection to Chaco Canyon, then other Pueblo nations likely possess similarly strong claims to various ancestral Pueblo sites. The ancestral Pueblo cultural sphere influenced much of the Southwest approximately 1,000 years ago, with evidence of connection extending into Mexico and toward the Pacific coast. The implications are staggering. The entire southwestern United States might be viewed not as a region of disconnected indigenous populations, but as the surviving descendants of a more integrated, more sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization than conventional narratives suggest. The elite matriline discovered in Pueblo Bonito becomes even more significant in this context. If women held authority in Chaco Canyon, and if that authority was transmitted through female descent lines, then understanding contemporary Pueblo leadership structures becomes necessary. Many Pueblo nations maintain matrilineal traditions. Some recognize women as property owners and decision makers in ways that diverge from European patriarchal models. The genetic discovery of an elite female lineage in Chaco Canyon might reflect the persistence of these traditions across nearly 1,000 years. The leadership that contemporary Pueblo women exercise might represent not an innovation of the modern era, but a continuation of ancestral authority structures that survived Spanish colonization and American subjugation. As implications continue to unfold, larger questions emerge about what else Western institutions have misunderstood about pre-Columbian America. If Chaco Canyon wasn't a collapsed civilization, but a deliberately managed center from which people migrated in organized ways, then what other sites have been misinterpreted through the lens of collapsed narratives? If oral histories proved accurate about Chaco Canyon when finally subjected to genetic testing, what other indigenous knowledge have we dismissed without adequate evaluation? If Pueblo women held authority structures that persisted across centuries, what other gender dynamics in indigenous societies might have been misunderstood by male-dominated academic institutions that projected Western patriarchal structures onto pre-Columbian civilizations? The research community has begun responding to these questions, with more partnerships forming between indigenous nations and researchers willing to work under tribal authority and consent. The model established by Picurius Pueblo and the University of Copenhagen represents a fundamental transformation in how knowledge about indigenous peoples gets produced and interpreted. But this transformation remains incomplete. Many archaeological sites remain subject to extraction and interpretation without meaningful tribal involvement. Many remains of indigenous ancestors continue to be held in museum collections against the wishes of descendant communities. Many oral histories remain untranslated into the scientific frameworks that Western institutions recognize as legitimate knowledge. What DNA has revealed about Chaco Canyon's ancient population is ultimately not simply interesting, it's revolutionary. It demonstrates that population genetics, approached with proper consent and tribal authority, can validate knowledge systems that Western academia had dismissed. It shows that civilizations don't necessarily collapse cleanly. They transform and persist in ways that conventional narratives fail to capture. It proves that the people of Chaco Canyon never disappeared. They're still here, still maintaining connection to their ancestral homeland, still preserving cultural knowledge across 13 centuries of colonization and struggle. And perhaps, most significantly, it demonstrates that when indigenous peoples are given control over research into their own history, the knowledge produced is both more accurate and more aligned with lived reality than research conducted under the colonial model that has dominated for centuries. The question now becomes not whether Picurius Pueblo's oral histories are accurate, that's been definitively established, but what we do with this knowledge. Will Western institutions genuinely transform their relationship to indigenous authority over ancestral sites and knowledge? Will Picurius Pueblo's genetic proof of ancestral connection translate into meaningful authority over what happens in and around Chaco Canyon? Will other indigenous nations have access to the resources and partnerships necessary to conduct similar research into their own ancestry? And perhaps, most pressingly, what other hidden truths about pre-Columbian America are we still failing to see because we haven't yet learned to listen to the people who have been holding this knowledge all along?